Sometimes a book is more than the sum of its parts. Sometimes it's not even the sum of its parts. The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa falls somewhere on that spectrum. And here I am, weeks later after finishing the book, I'm still unsure of where it lies. But on that note, if you would like to hear my chapter by chapter thoughts of this novel, check out the card above. It was the last book I dedicated to my read-along book club. But The Memory Police is my kind of sci-fi. Right? You can ease right into it. It's not full of jargon. It's not full of space battles. There's not a massive prologue of expository dumps telling you about the whatever wars. No, this is firmly seated in the human condition. It's more about ideas and less about events. And if you're very familiar with Kazuo Ishiguro's work, you will be right at home here. And yes, savvy person out there watching this video right now, you were right. The Memory Police definitely evokes George Orwell's 1984, The Thought Police. And in fact, there are some similarities here, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin with the hook. What is The Memory Police about? An unnamed young female novelist on an unnamed island lives in a community where things are disappearing, but not visually disappearing, disappearing from comprehension. A totalitarian group known as the Memory Police keep these disappearances in check. Because if you're lucky or unlucky enough to not forget disappeared things, they will round you up and take you away to their headquarters, where very few return. So what did I think? Well, let us begin with character. And I'm going to give credit where credit is due. Lee over on the Discord, yes, I have a Discord, you should totally join it and read along with us and talk about all kinds of other things. But anyway, he pointed this out while reading this book, and it's something that is very interesting to think about. And that is the fact that the only named character, there's only one named character this entire novel, and that character is named R. Yes, a single letter. He is the editor of our protagonist, who is a writer. So that concept is something that I'm still mulling over. Overall, the character work is solid. It doesn't get in the way, but it's not taking you to any deep emotional places. At least it didn't with me. Yes, there are ups and downs. Yes, there are traumatic events and so on and so forth. But I never found myself completely connected with the characters in a deeply emotional way. So we should start with our unnamed narrator. Yes, the young lady who is a novelist. Yes, a novelist. Normally I would scoff at that concept. Stephen King, I'm looking at you. Something about a writer writing about a writer. It's a little cliche. It's a little obvious, one might say. But here it is grounded in purpose, thematic purpose. Because again, someone who literally pulls things from thin air, writes them down on paper, creating ideas from seemingly nothing. What does the concept of things losing meaning mean? So I can appreciate the significance of our protagonist being a writer. Finally, a profession echoes the theme of the book. She does have trauma, like any good character. She lost both of her parents at a very young age. But again, like I mentioned, I never felt a really deep emotional connection. You're not going to shed a tear in this book, at least I didn't. It could be partially due to the dreamlike setting of the book. It could be partially due to the translation, because this was written in Japanese first. More on that later. But the strongest thing about the character work in this novel is not the characters in isolation. It's how they connect, right? It's how they relate to one another. You have an old man, right? He's another primary character in this book. He was somewhat of a caretaker to our narrator because she lost her parents at a very young age. So there is this grandfatherly connection, but then there's also R, as I mentioned, the editor, the fiction editor for the narrator. He has this little problem where he can't forget things that have disappeared, right? So he's in danger. And so we create this string of caregiving, one might say. It's a multi-layered, a three-layered string where we have this dependency, where if one of these things falls apart, the entire story falls apart. All right, let us talk about the plot next. And this is where things get even more interesting or strange, depending on how you look at it, depending on your perspective. But as I mentioned, the disappearance. The disappearance is not a visual disappearance, right? As I imagined it was when I read the description of the story. It is a disappearance of mind, meaning this thing can still exist physically in the real world, but we just can't quite comprehend it, right? These things, once something has been discovered to have been disappeared, these things are ceremoniously destroyed by the inhabitants of the small village where our narrator and the rest of these characters exist. But sometimes you can't destroy everything, right? Like animals or birds that fly in the sky. But these things are always somewhat out of focus if they disappeared and we cannot destroy them. Their names are always on the tip of our tongue. But as things continue to disappear, I'm sure you can imagine everything becomes more dire. The old man is briefly taken away by the memory police, but he's returned more or less unharmed. R, the man who cannot forget things, is taken into the narrator's house. And they create this secret little cubbyhole in the basement of the home to hide him away from the memory police. Side characters as well continue to disappear. An earthquake hits, a tsunami decimates the island, so you can see things are completely ramping up. But that is where this novel is completely different than probably most novels you've read, and you may think this is a good thing or a bad thing. Innately, as humans, with our exposure to film and books and games and everything else. I mean, when we were sitting around campfires concocting what the meaning of the stars above our heads were, we are familiar with storytelling. And all of these events, like I said, the old man being taken away by the memory police, other people being taken away, are being hidden in this little nook of a room. None of these events end up the way you think they would. They don't play out in the way that we've been, let's say, programmed. So you almost feel like you're at the top of this roller coaster drop, but this drop is unlike any drop you've ever experienced. But that was the biggest puzzle of the novel for me. Was the author trying to subvert our expectations? Was she trying to break tropes? Or was she not trying to say anything at all? That is something that I'm still unsure of. I would also like to mention there's a parallel story in this book. So our protagonist, she is a novelist, and she is writing a novel, as novelists do. But we experience the novel firsthand in this book. Now, I don't want you to think you're flipping back and forth between the narrative we're experiencing in real time versus the one she's writing. It's probably 15-ish% of the novel. There's entire chapters dedicated to this. But the most interesting thing about it, I think, is how it begins to parallel the story we are experiencing outside of the novel. The real novel, the novel we're reading, not the novel within the novel. I'm a writer, if you're not a writer out there, but if you're an artist of any kind, if you're a creator of any kind, you'll know that we're always inspired by the things around us, the things we consume. So books we read, people we meet, places we go, et cetera, and events we experience. And so you'll see that manifesting itself within our work all the way up until the culmination of the novel, which again, I didn't quite completely understand the connection there, but I cannot fault the author unless I'm able to speak to her directly and just get a definitive answer. Was there meaning? Was there no meaning? Or is that the meaning? And on that note, there are many threads in this book, not plot threads, but thematic threads, I guess. All of these things that are kind of interweaving to create the master theme of the memory police, that being the power of memory. I'm not quite sure how they all connect. Like I said, we have the novel. Within the novel, we have the events in the story that may or may not end up the way we imagined. There's lots of conversations between characters that evoke these kinds of thematic questions. But the one thing I got out of this is the power of meaning, right? What things mean, not only what objects or people mean to us, but what we mean to them. But as I mentioned, once I got to the end of this book, I was left wondering, how does it all connect? How does it all fit together? I think we're always, as readers, trying to assemble these puzzles that these writers create for us. But also, does this thing even connect at all? All right, well, let us talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. This was originally written Japanese, translated by a man named Steven Snyder, and I feel like it's overall a great translation. If you are not new to my channel, you'll know that Haruki Murakami has been a pain point for me. I've heard so many great things about him. I've read an entire novel. I've read a couple of short stories of his. And his books are originally written in Japanese, translated to English, and I always felt the writing to be severely lacking for me, right? It's as if people don't feel authentic. It's as if the stories just kind of go nowhere on a line-by-line basis. Things just feel very empty a lot of the time. But even worse than that, sometimes people vocalize their thoughts, right? Their innermost desires. And being a Western writer and reader, again, this could be a separation of culture, but we prefer subtext, right? We like reading between the lines. We like not what people are saying being what they truly mean, right? We can see it through their actions, their expressions, and even the framing of the shot. In my opinion, this novel is far better than Murakami's translations. Sure, there are aspects of the book where the writing feels a little bit stilted. Sometimes the characters are saying things that I feel like no human would ever utter aloud in a conversation, in a serious manner anyway. But again, I kind of attribute that to cultural differences. But there are some truly beautiful lines in this novel. There's foreshadowing. The writing evokes emotion. There is a clear rhythm to it, which is why I'm going to give The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa an 8 out of 10. An intimately connected cast of characters that are definitely more than the sum of their parts on a dreamlike island, a dreamlike setting, at the center of which lies a compelling mystery. Why are things disappearing? And remember, not just visually disappearing, but their meaning disappearing. But a plot that weaves you gently through this dreamlike setting to places that didn't quite connect for me. But as I always say, the best books are the ones that force you to think of them long after you've completed them. And just because I didn't solve this puzzle doesn't mean it's unsolvable, nor does it mean it has to be solved or is meant to be solved. But more than anything, this book will make you think about the significance of memory and meaning, the power that it holds, not only with objects and people and events, but the memory of us and what we leave behind. Well, I hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know in the comments below. Did you read this book? Do you disagree with me? Do you agree with me? And if you would like to see my own creative work, my own novels, check out the link in the description below. And thanks for hanging out with me as always. And thanks for watching. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.